Hey guys, we are in lesson 18, the mechanisms of evolution. If you missed anything from lesson 17, you can go back in this slideshow. You can go back through our folder. Everything's still there. All my videos are still posted. I didn't take anything away. So in this section on mechanisms of evolution, we're going to look a little bit closer at some of the evidence for evolution. We know that evolution takes place through a set of processes that includes mutation, adaptation, natural selection, and extinction. The picture you see over here is showing the change over time in our horse species. And if you look at the 50 MYA, the MYA stands for million years ago. So they've been able to find fossils for various stages of our horse, our equus, our horse species, and you can see how much it's changed over millions and millions of years, not overnight. We've got a couple definitions that we need to think about in this unit. And we also have a couple rules that we need to remember. Rule number one is that individuals don't evolve. So here's an individual. And if this fish is like, man, I wish I had, like bigger teeth so I could be more ferocious. Like that's just too bad for him. Individuals can't evolve. You have the genes that you have. Rule number two is for a population to evolve, there must be variation and environmental pressure. So remember what a population is. A population is a group of organisms of the same kind of species that live in the same area. A population competes with each other for food, mates, water, space, all types of resources. And if we look at this population of fish, you can see some are bigger, some are medium, some are tiny. So that's the variation. That's the variation that's involved. So there's got to be variation and there's got to be some type of environmental pressure. If it doesn't matter how big these fish are, like they all have the same amount of fitness and the size of the fish doesn't really matter, then this population is going to stay relatively stable. You'll still have the same percentages of big fish and medium fish and small fish. But if there's some sort of an environmental pressure, that means that the size of the fish in one way or another is advantageous. Maybe the big fish can't swim as fast, so predators have an easier time catching them. That would be an environmental pressure that could change the demographic of this population over time. That would be evolution. If same thing in the other direction, maybe if the small fish are slower swimmers and they can't get away from predators, they're going to get eaten. They're not going to be able to pass their genes on to future generations. We're going to see this population change over time. We are going to revisit these levels of organization in ecology, and we're going to revisit the definition of population in ecology. But the levels of organization, go from individual to population to community to ecosystem. Then we start thinking about the biome that we live in, and then the biosphere, which refers to the part of the planet where life can exist. More vocab. A species, we were talking back here about this individual being part of the same kind of species, a population being part of a population. A species is an organism that can breed and produce fertile offspring. So we know some examples of organisms that can hybrid. They can hybridize and cross species, have offspring. But those offspring, if they're sterile, that means those offspring are not of the same species. So we know, for instance, that a horse and a donkey can cross with each other to have a mule. Mules can't have baby mules. Mules are sterile or fertile. So that's how a horse and a donkey are not of the same species. They are genetically similar enough to have an offspring together, but that offspring is not fertile. The offspring can't have offspring. So technically speaking, they're not of the same species. You have to have these two things checked off. You can breed and produce fertile offspring to be the same species. All right, so looking at this population, we're going to start adding the genetic component to understanding evolution here. This is the mechanism, the genetics behind it. We know that a population is a group of individuals of the same species that can mate and produce fertile offspring. So here's a population of frogs. All right, they've got some variation. Some are red, some are purple, some are green. They've got some variety, but they're all of the same species. They can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. Just like we have different characteristics, we have variety. Okay, lots of populations of organisms have variety among the members of their population. When we look at the variation, we are talking about the gene pool. And you've probably heard gene pool used before in conversation, maybe, or you've heard it somewhere, maybe. But a gene pool is referring to all the different genes, or we've called them alleles back in Unit 6, all the different genes or alleles that are present in that population. So the gene pool for this population of frogs has as many greens as there are green frogs and as many purple alleles as there are purple frogs, And then the allele frequency is referring to the number of times an allele occurs in that population. So when we're studying evolution, we're trying to figure out if the gene pool is changing over time, if there's some sort of a environmental pressure acting on a specific variation of that population. Is it making that population change over time? Putting this all together, we can define evolution in genetic terms by stating that evolution involves any change in the frequency of alleles in a population over time. So taking a look, this is just such a great graphic here. Taking a look at these mice, there's the brown mice, light brown, and the gray or dark colored mice. And this population of mice happens to live where a community, a little group of fox have come in. All right, so the fox just moved in to the mouse neighborhood. The mice were chilling, 50-50. Gray mice living among the brown mice. Everybody was happy, and their allele frequency was 50-50. So this population of mice has variation, but when Mr. Fox moved in, then it also had environmental pressure in the form of a predator. Now, this fox has an amazing ability to be able to see the dark colored mice better because the brown fur is really good camouflage for these guys. It didn't matter before the environmental pressure came into play. The variation was just like, whatever, you're light brown, I'm dark gray. Like, we're still 50-50 because there was no environmental pressure. But now that the fox moved in, we've got environmental pressure, and the fox is able to see the gray mice because they're not as good at camouflage. So after he shows up here and he just has a feast, the next generation of this population has less dark gray mice. Okay, because he ate a whole bunch of them. They weren't able to pass their genes on to their offspring as much as the brown ones were. So the next generation, we see that the allele frequency has changed. We would be looking at this in terms of evolution and saying that this population is evolving. This population is changing over time due to a selective environmental pressure being put upon a population of the variety that exists in this population. Third generation, it gets even worse. Third generation, we still have little a. We still have little a. So if these two mice decided to hook up, they decided to make some offspring, there's a 25% chance we could start having gray mice repopulate in this population, especially if now the fox can't find any gray mice. He gets bored, he moves on to another group of mice. We might start to see some gray mice come back into the population if those alleles are still floating around. There's another possibility that within the fourth generation, you no longer even see these alleles. this characteristic could end up getting eradicated from the population. But right now, in the third generation, there's still a chance the gray mouse can make a comeback. But we would have to see. We would have to see what happens if the fox leaves or if the fox finds a way to eat the light brown mice. So, where does this genetic variation come from? What made some of the mice gray and some of the mice brown in the first place? There's some different places that genetic variation can come from. One is some random chance in a mutation. Two, we talked about this before in recombination during prophase of meiosis one, that crossing over occurs. You've got mom's chromosomes and dad's side of chromosomes, and they just kind of rub up on each other and then separate again. And what happened is some of the blue swapped with the red, some of the red swapped with the blue. And we're thankful for this because we're not a clone of our brother and sister. Okay. This is how we have some variation among siblings of the same family, right? So we've got recombination that adds genetic variation, and we also have a random pairing of gametes, so anytime sexual reproduction occurs, you are mixing up the genes, okay? So we're not asexually reproducing through like binary fission. The random pairing of gametes in sexual reproduction also causes genetic variation. Um, I just said that mutations are important in how populations change over time because they do result in genetic changes in the gene pool, especially if the mutation is something that's beneficial. We'll talk about that in a minute. They're heritable, meaning they can be inherited because it changes your DNA. And that's if especially during meiosis, that's what's passed on to your offspring. All right, so like I promised, some mutations are favorable. Okay, they're going to increase your ability to survive in your environment. The prickly leaves on a cactus are a result of years and years and years of adaptation over time that allows the cactus to be very good at conserving water. So these are the types of plants that live in very dry environments because their tiny little prickly needles for leaves are very good at conserving water. Not a lot of water evaporates off of the surface of the cactus needles. So that's a favorable change that increases its ability to survive in its environment. An unfavorable mutation we most often see in an instance where it's like, ooh, they're going to get eaten. Like they're going to be visible to predators. An unfavorable change that decreases the organism's ability to survive. Like these albino tortoises, like that's unfortunate for them. Luckily, this picture you can tell that they're captive, but if this albino tortoise, hatched in the wild, he would be real easy to see for the predators. And then there's also mutations that don't impact your ability at all to survive. So these attached earlobes are technically a mutation. Don't look over at your friend and call them a mutant if they have attached earlobes. Like we're not shaming anyone with attached earlobes. It's pretty common in populations of humans at this point, but technically speaking, it's a change in the DNA over time that really has no impact on your ability to survive. They're just attached to your head. So those are different types of mutations. All right. So, increased genetic variation among individuals in a given population increases your likelihood for survival in a changing environment. So, high genetic diversity helps populations survive. Low genetic diversity can lead to inbreeding and depression, and you reduce the diversity in your gene pool. Genetically similar individuals have a higher risk of producing offspring that have hereditary diseases. If we look at this little moose picture here, if there was some sort of environmental pressure, moose population is not very diverse. If there was some sort of an environmental pressure that was going to eliminate the dark gray moose, but allow the red moose to survive, this moose population would be very endangered, if not extinct. Same thing if we look back at our mice here, this is not a very genetically diverse population. There's some diversity, there's brown mice and gray mice, but you can see just within a couple generations, we are a uniform population. If some other predator came along, let's say a bear, I don't know. If like an owl is something that actually eats mice. If an owl came along and was really good at picking off the brown mice, this population's in danger because it doesn't have any variation. So, genetically diverse populations stand a better chance of survival when that environmental pressure comes along. Where we have a real life experience of this, like not going well, is the cheetah population. The world's population of cheetah has declined in recent years to fewer than 20,000, and that might not sound so bad, but as these, this guy was wandering around, he was traveling for miles looking for a mate. Habitat destruction starts coming into play. Hunters are coming into play, and now instead of walking around hundreds of and thousands of miles looking for a mate, he's really just like walking around his neighborhood. So maybe the only maybe the only other cheetah he can mate with is kind of related to him. And that's going to reduce their genetic diversity. Recent genetic analysis has found that the total cheetah population has very little genetic diversity. Cheetahs appear to have narrowly escaped extinction at the end of the last ice age between 10 and 20,000 years ago. All modern cheetah have arisen from a single surviving litter. This is part of the reason that they have a very low genetic diversity. We're going to compound this with the fact that they're losing their range, their habitat is being destructed at a very rapid pace. So their genetic diversity is very low. This makes them more susceptible to disease, and it makes it more likely that a change in their environment could very easily wipe them out. There's a lot of, and you can look this up. There's a lot of talk about this current state of extinction. We are in a period of extinction. Many organisms are becoming extinct very rapidly. And it's unlikely at this point that large cats and large mammals are going to make it through this round of extinction. It's very hard for them to survive because of their environmental pressure and because of their low genetic diversity. The relationship between animals and the selection pressures of their environments is very complex. All creatures on the planet today are a result of millions and millions of years of these back and forth interactions. Generation after generation of natural selection for traits and genes, or some organisms are just a little bit more fit for each population's unique and changing environment. Yet, for each species and each adaptation, the underlying mechanism is the same. In response to selective pressure, the frequency of traits and the genes controlling those traits changes in a population over time. That's a really good definition. So, increased genetic variation among individuals in a given population increases their likelihood for surviving in a changing environment. One of the selective pressures or environmental pressures we talked about, the easy one to use as an example is a predator. There's other environmental pressures, and a mnemonic device is panda paw. Panda paw. It's funny to say. Try it. You've got your predators, your availability of resources. So that's an environmental pressure, such as shelter, water, your nutrient supply, your food sources, disease, or the spread of a pathogen within a population, accumulation of wastes. When I think about accumulation of wastes, I think about if you put too many fish in the fishbowl and the fishbowl water gets nasty, that's accumulation of waste. That's an environmental pressure. There's density independent factors. These have no consideration on the number of organisms. This can happen whether there's one organism present or 500. And again, fishbowl. You've got your natural disasters, your abiotic factors such as temperature, carbon dioxide, and your weather conditions. So panda paw, density dependent factors and density independent factors. And we will be revisiting these in ecology. All right. So, finally, what are some things that can enable an organism to better survive in its environment? And that would be an adaptation. All right. When we look at organisms and the way that they survive in their environment, the way that the organism is structured gives you some insight into the world that it lives in. So, the panda bear, polar bear, rather, is a really good example of that. His fur, you looking at the fur, you can be like, this organism probably lives in a snowy environment. Yes. He's got this muscle hump on his shoulders for catching large prey. Okay. He's got these large furry feet. They're very broad. They're like snowshoes for walking on the snow and ice. His white, like we said, his white fur helps him stay camouflaged. We know he has it's almost translucent fur, but his skin is dark in color, which helps him absorb the sun's heat. So the polar bear has a lot of adaptations that enable him to survive in a very unforgiving environment like the Arctic. Depending on the rate of reproduction, the adaptations, and I'm sorry, depending on the rate of adaptation, the rate of reproduction, and the environmental factors present, structural adaptations can take millions of years to develop, or, like we saw with the grants, organisms that have a higher rate of reproduction, and it's usually smaller. The smaller you are, the quicker they reproduce. So, insects, um, bacteria, they have a really quick rate of reproduction. Like one insect can lay thousands of eggs. So, you're going to actually be able to see evolution take place in these populations, whereas with humans we typically 9 to 10 month gestational period. The average people have, I think the average rate of reproduction in humans is like 2.5. So it's going to take a long time to see structural adaptations in humans. Something I did want to point out to you, just because of it being relevant in news right now, is virus reproduction in terms of its RO factor. And the R, you may have heard this in the news talking about, the Rona. That's not what RO stands for, but it's the rate of infection. So if patient zero here infects 2 people, okay, this would be an RO of 2. And that would mean that for every person infected, they're going to infect 2 other people. So an RO of 1 would mean for every person infected, they're just going to infect 1 other person. You can have an RO of 0.5, which would mean you have a declining rate of infection. So that's another way that we look at rate of reproduction. All right, at this time, we're together going to watch the Amoeba Sisters talk about natural selection.